The motto of the Financial Times is without fear and without favor. The Financial Times is an independent newspaper. I was never told you have to write this because it will please this company, this advertiser. Never, ever.
This is The Talent Show, a new podcast series from FT Talent, a hub of innovation from the Financial Times. It's hosted by under 30s for the under 30s around the world. This second series is about all the aspects the FT organization is covering today, from editorial to development, from data to talent. I am Virginia Stagni, and this is a guide we designed to inspire you to be the one driving innovation and change. Welcome to the show. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Virginia. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you for being with us. This is our very own talent show about the Financial Times, about our brand, about the FT people. And we have Michael Skapinker with us, and it's great to have you here. I've been working with you when I started my career, so you are one of the very, very first people I work for here at the Financial Times, so I'm a bit emotional about this episode. And I'll let, I think all of you know about Michael, because we have been talking about Michael a bit on the FT Talent social media, but he's a Financial Times contributing editor, an award-winning columnist, and a management educator. You were born in South Africa, but you have been living in London for quite a bit now. But of course, because of your job, and we're going to explore about that today, you have been really traveling all over the world. In your 34 years at the Financial Times, you have been from the FT Weekend editor, management editor, and aerospace correspondent. You have run leadership development programs for some of the world's leading companies and organizations, including the European Central Bank, Siemens, Santander, and Clifford Chance. And it's great to have you here and we literally learn as much as possible from you. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you.
Michael, the first question maybe is quite obvious that I'm asking you this, but it's what really intrigued me the first time I met you, is really understanding 34 years at the Financial Times. When and how did you know you wanted to be a journalist?
How did I know I wanted to be a journalist? I actually considered a couple of careers, and actually my degree, my studies were in political science and then in law. I actually considered becoming a lawyer, but at a certain point when I'd finished university, I actually went to work in Greece as an English teacher. And after a year, the school I was working for went bankrupt.
Okay, so you already saw a few trends of things that you would have reporting on.
So I decided I had always been interested in journalism. I had been a student journalist at university. So what I did is I went to the Foreign Press Association, the Athens Foreign Press Association, and I got their membership book because, of course, this was before online, this was before the internet. It was a little book. And I went to each journalist in the book and I asked them if I could do some work for them. And then one day I walked into the office it was the office of the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph. It was the same correspondent, a man called Paul Anastasiadis. And he was the correspondent in Athens for many, many news organizations. And he listened to me talk for a while. He heard my accent. And he said to me, "Are you from South Africa?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've got this South African group of newspapers. I haven't got enough time. I tell you what, take that seat in the corner where there's a typewriter. They pay me £11 per article. Whatever you publish, you can keep £7.
Here we go. Okay.
And then I was a journalist.
And that's how you started your career.
That's how I started my career.
That's okay. First takeaway, I think, proactiveness. When you understand what you want and you try, to find your ways into an industry, be proactive and go to the practitioners. So this is an example for our listeners to really learn by doing. And I think that's something that, because of all the degrees and the courses, MBAs, everything we can learn in books, is quite intriguing, I think, to see that in your times, but maybe even today, is really important to get a first hands-on experience. In terms of then becoming an editor and literally starting your career at the Financial Times, one of the best and maybe the leading institution in financial journalism. How did you get there? What are the kind of things that did you need to upskill yourself in a certain way? And what's your suggestion, for younger journalists out there?
Well, journalism has changed an enormous amount. We're talking 40 years now. And as I said, there was no such thing as the internet then. Everything was in print. Today we have, and there was broadcasting, there was radio. I used to do radio journalism as well. So when I was in Athens, I also became the correspondent for LBC, which existed then, and also for CBS radio in the US. So there was always, there was broadcasting, there was print, but now there's everything. Journalism is a very integrated field now. It used to be in those days you would either be a print journalist or you would be a broadcast journalist. Now you've got to be everything. So how did I come to be at the FT? And I think there's some lessons in how to become a journalist in all of this. So while I was in Greece, I spent 3 years working as a journalist. I worked for a lot of different news organizations. And what I did, and I think this is something people should still try to do, try to get published in as many publications as you can. So I managed to get published in the New York Times, I managed to get published in the Daily Telegraph, and I managed to get published in the Spectator. And then I came to London. I had been a student in England. I came back to England, and I started the same thing, going around trying to become a journalist. I used to keep a folder of all my rejection letters, of all the jobs I applied for and didn't get a job, and I think there were 45 letters.
Okay, so you definitely managed nicely rejection and that sense of failure. And I think it's something that is quite common when you're starting your career, but even in your mid-career, I think it's like when you want to embrace a new challenge, you need to be ready to face rejection. How did you go about that?
It's tough. And, when you said I accepted it, I mean, some of the rejections were worse than others. I'll tell you about one of them. The two publications I really, really wanted to work for were the Financial Times and The Economist. The Economist, I thought was a very interesting, well-written publication. The Financial Times, I just loved the Financial Times, and I know you did as well. I mean, you've told me...
I did, and I still do. I'm here.
And I've quoted you in the book saying you were an FT fangirl. I was an FT fanboy.
Here we go.
And I applied to the Financial Times, and I got a nice letter back saying, I'm sorry, we can't offer you a job at the moment. Your qualifications are quite good, which was a nice thing to hear. But we don't have anything. The Economist, I got a letter back from the editor's PA saying the editor says he doesn't have a job and he asks you please not to write to him again. So I have to say, one of my best friends, and I would say one of my mentors, is Ed Carr, who I met at the FT, who is today the deputy editor of The Economist. Okay. No hard feelings, none whatsoever. So in the meantime, I finally, after 45 letters, managed to get a job with McGraw-Hill World News, which had a lot of trade publications. They had energy publications. So I started working for them. And that took me, as I said, 45 rejections, and I got a job with them. But I kept applying to the FT. I applied a second time. No, thank you. I didn't even get an interview. The third time, I was working for a little magazine at McGraw-Hill at that time called International Management, which was about management. And there was a very experienced journalist in the office next door. We had little offices in those days. He came into my office and he said, I've just had the Financial Times on the phone. They're looking for a junior management writer. Do we know anybody? So I said, how about me? And he said, oh, all right. I'll ask them if they're interested. I came into the building, which is the building we're in now, by the way, Bracken House, but it was a very old-looking building in those days. And I had 11 interviews.
11 interviews?
11 interviews with 11 different editors. Okay. The editor, the deputy editor. And I had an interview, first of all, with a man called Christopher Lorenz, who was the management editor, and he was going to be my boss if I got the job. And he then contacted me and he said, your interviews have gone fine. The only thing is the one person who doesn't want to take you on at the Financial Times is the managing editor, a man called David Bell. But he wants to give you a second interview. So he asked me to come in at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. I went in. He interviewed me, a very tough interview. And at the end of it, he said, okay, I think we would like to offer you a job. It was Friday night at 7 o'clock, but it's the weekend coming up. So we would like to offer you a job. Maybe you want to think about it. So I said to him, no, I don't want to think about it. I want the job. So he said, really? So I said, yeah. So he said, okay, well, then I'd better type out an offer letter for you in case I get run over by a bus on the weekend. And he said to me, I'm sorry, I'm not a very good typist, which was interesting. He typed out the letter, I've still got it, offering me a job. He said, the salary we will talk about later, which we did. And I accepted the job there and then. I didn't even know the salary.
That was a big drive for the brand. Definitely.
It wasn't just the brand. I wanted to work at the Financial Times because the Financial Times, I felt, and after all these years, I still feel it, was an honest newspaper.
Can you elaborate a bit about that? What do you mean by honest newspaper?
It's a really good question. What I mean by that, and this is particularly important today in this era that we have of fake news, the Financial Times is about money. It's about investment. And because of that, you can't lie to people. If you tell them something because you think it should be true, and they invest their money and they lose their money, they're not going to trust you. And because of that, you've always got to tell them what you think is the truth. You might turn out to be wrong, but the one thing that the Financial Times insists on is get the facts right. It's the most important thing. It's integrity. The motto of the Financial Times is without fear and without favor. The Financial Times is an independent newspaper. Of course, we're supported by advertisers. We have contacts with companies, with corporations, but they never influence. I was never told you have to write this because it will please this company, this advertiser. Never, ever. And so I got the job. I walked in the door. I remember the date. It was the 20th of October, 1986. I walked in the door of Bracken House and I looked around and I thought, I never want to work anywhere else. And the other thing that is great about the Financial Times is every 4 or 5 years, you were expected to change jobs. And this was great because it meant you always wrote about a different sector. I wrote about electronics, I wrote about leisure industries, I wrote about tourism, I wrote about the computer industry, I wrote about management. And then I became an editor. And I was the editor of the Weekend Financial Times. I was the editor of FT Special Reports. Because you have to change jobs every few years, it's a little bit like doing a new university degree every few years. And this is the thing about the FT, but it's also true about journalism. This is the great thing about journalism. There is always something new. No day is ever the same as the day before, and you're always learning. You know, as technology changed, as political developments happened, I always had to learn. And this is the great thing about it. You're never stuck.
And journalism, we say is a first draft of history. So you are actually having a certain role in the storytelling that we are giving of our society, our culture. And I find it very interesting what you were saying about changing and rotating jobs to really, that is something that, Gen Z is requesting now to employers, right? To see the career growth, changing the fields where they can really, test themselves and challenge themselves. But there is a question that I have for you. How, as a journalist, you keep up with all the different changes and, of course, a bit of like a specialized vertical knowledge on an industry? How do you prepare yourself for turning into, someone that knows about aerospace and then moves into pharmaceuticals? Like, how do you do that?
It's a really good question, that. And what I should say is obviously this isn't the only way to have a career. In some careers, you advance by becoming such an expert and so knowledgeable about your field that you basically help it to change and you learn the changes. So, for example, if you're a doctor, as a junior doctor, sure, you might move around from, obstetrics to radiology to general practice, but eventually you have to specialize because you've got to become a real expert. You can't have a doctor who changes their career every few years. The thing about journalism, though, and this is why it's such a privilege, you are basically put in the position where you ask the experts to teach you. You go and interview people, you go and visit factories, you go and visit laboratories, and you basically say, tell me what you're doing. And sometimes people say, how can you write about this if you don't understand it as well as I understand it? And my answer always to that is the role of the journalist is to interpret this for a broader public. If you can't explain it to me, I can't explain it to the world. So how do you become specialist in these different areas? You basically speak to as many people as possible, visit as many places as possible, just have your mind open to learning.
This is such an interesting answer that you gave, because that's something that I keep asking myself, even for consultants and other business roles that need to juggle between different industries, between different needs. And that's typically even what a manager needs to do when they are changing companies or changing the conversation with different stakeholders within the same company. So I see the role and the job of a journalist as something that is such a skill that can be translated in other jobs and in other industries, and I find it very fascinating, that thing, that being able to explain it to me, to explain it to the public, because I think journalism is still and should still be about accessibility to what is considered an inaccessible / elitist topic expertise. And you mentioned, and for our listeners, the motto of the Financial Times, without fear, without favor, is still on the paper, written down on each single printed newspaper that we have, and you find it with our old logo on our pink paper. How do you interpret that today? With so many different sources, people inform themselves on Twitter or Instagram. How do we keep the signature, let's say, of a journalist like yourself, as well as the brand of a paper, relevant, especially to younger audience in such a cybernetic, complicated space as the infosphere today?
Okay, well, I actually think what we've got to look at, we've got this very interesting debate going on at the moment with Elon Musk buying Twitter and the verified account. What does that blue tick mean? It used to mean that you are who you say you are. Okay, he's now thinking of changing this, maybe turning it into something you can buy. I think in a time when we are not certain what the truth is, who's telling the truth, there are, as you say, so many news sources. But we've got to ask them, and I think it's something that all young people need to learn, children need to learn it. What is a reputable source? You know, what is a source you can trust? What is a trustworthy source? And so I think if you can create a brand like the Financial Times, where you know they are doing their best to tell the truth, I think you can establish a niche in that way. And I think it's true as a journalist as well. If you become known to the people you write about as somebody who always accurately represent the truth, not necessarily saying things that they like or backing their company, but if they say, all right, I didn't like everything you wrote, but I realized you were being honest about it. I think that is how you establish yourself, not just in journalism, but in the world generally today.
I think this is really interesting in terms of like building trust. And that's something that you need to do with customers, especially with younger generations of any brand. And today, leaders and brands are asked, requested by society, to really meet certain standards in terms of like their actions towards that trust relationship. And because, of course, the competition is so high in any field, of course, the one of news is one of them. But let's think about all the other services that other companies are offering. You need to keep being true to yourself and have a mission and a vision for what your company is standing for. And that's something that you write quite a lot about in your last book. So we got the presentation a few weeks ago here at the Financial Times at Bracken House. Is inside the Leaders Club. I really highly suggest you to read this, because Michael is walking us through how top companies deal with pressing business issues. And here you are collecting some of the best meetings and interviews, and as well like really connections that you had with business leaders. How did you come up with the idea of the book and starting this book? And what is maybe the best lessons for some of the younger listeners out there out of the Leaders Club conversations?
Okay, let me answer your first question first. How did I get this idea for the book? So I moderate many FT events. And I moderate events for Headspring, which is where you and I met, which is the FT's executive education company. And I moderate events for an organization called FT Forums, which is a networking event for companies. And we have so much information. We have top speakers, top CEOs coming to this, and there are different groups. There's a high potential leaders group coming to FT forums. There's an FT forums women's group. And at the end of one of them, I said to Mike Hepburn, who's the managing director of FT forums, we've got so much information here. Why don't we write a book about it? And this is where the idea for Inside the Leaders Club came from, is putting together all of the information available to the FT, both that the FT has published, but also the meetings that the FT has held. We put this book together. So that was the origin of the book. What are the lessons for younger readers and for all of you watching this now? I think there are a couple of things, because there's some very strong themes in the book. And I think I would like to highlight three themes in the book. The first is that I think we have had a revolution in the past couple of years between managers and the people they manage. I think the balance of power has shifted. It's shifted away from bosses towards the workers. This has happened, I think, largely for demographic reasons. In most developed economies, and I include here countries like Japan, Korea, also China, we basically have an aging population. We have a shortage of young people. And so young people, all of you, are in a powerful position. There aren't enough of you. And therefore you have more choices now. And I think that means that companies have to make workplaces places where people really want to work. And we saw this with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns. When the lockdowns lifted and companies said to people, we want you back in the office, as we all know, a lot of people have said, I'm not going back every day. I will come in some days a week, but I don't want to come in every day. And managers have found, some of them have tried to insist, like Elon Musk, but generally they found that people have a choice now. So I think that's theme number one, is that the balance of power has shifted. It's shifted towards employees. Theme number two, the multi-generational workforce. We've got people who are entering the workforce for the first time. We've got people working in the company who are easily old enough to be their parents, maybe old enough even to be their grandparents. We've got a multi-generational workforce. Now, as you see, if you read the book, I'm not a big fan of these labels. Baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z, because people are different from each other. We're all individuals. But I think people are at different stages in their careers. They are at different stages in their lives. People starting out who are very different situation, very hard for them now to find housing in most big cities. They don't have the kind of pensions that their parents and grandparents had. And then you've got an older generation who are much more secure. You've got to learn how to get on. And I think each of the generations in the workforce has got something to offer. We get a lot of energy. And I have to say, from the generation coming in now, the millennials and Gen Z, I find a real seriousness about work. People take it seriously. We can talk later about things like quiet quitting. I actually think the majority of people really want to work. They really want to get things done. They take life seriously. They've been through some serious time. I mean, we've had COVID, in Europe now, really for the first time since the Second World War, we've got a major war going on, which has affected many people. So that is issue number two, is the multi-generational workforce. And then the third issue is that companies realize now that they are part of society. And society makes demands of them. And young people coming into the workforce now, many of them want to work for a company they believe in. Now, this isn't new. As I said to you, I wanted to work for the Financial Times all that time ago because it was a news organization I believed in. But I think it's a very, very important issue today.
And I think this is something that we see in many different countries. It's not just a matter of the word here in the UK. It's really reflected all over the planet. And something I really loved about this book is the diversity of cultures that you are touching upon, as well as the cases that you're bringing in. And considering all the countries and the cultures that you have met in your amazing career, how did you change your communication and your approach to the different countries that you met?
This is such an interesting question. So I've lived in 4 countries. I speak 4 languages. I have traveled to nearly 40 countries for work. There's one big issue. It's been very favorable for somebody like me who grew up speaking English, that English is now the world language. Not because English is a better language, it's just historical circumstances. We had the British Empire, which spread English. And then after the Second World War, when the British Empire collapsed, we had the power of America. So in other words, just for that reason, English became what Latin or Greek or Arabic once were. So the one issue I've learned is if you are a native speaker of English, as I have, if you've been speaking English your whole life, you really need to learn how to speak to other people. Because I think there's a certain kind of business English that everybody understands. And what I've found is you often have a situation where, let's say, you have Argentinians, Germans, Japanese, Chinese, Indonesians in the room. Everybody's fine. They speak English. Then you get a native English speaker from America or Canada or the UK or Australia, and suddenly nobody understands what they're saying. Because I think native English speakers do not understand how difficult it is to work in another language. Now, I worked in Greece. I had to work in Greek. I realized how difficult it is to work in a second language and what an achievement it is. So this is one of the very important things I've learned. That's lesson number one from an English speaker, native English speaker's point of view. Lesson number two, and what I've discovered, is people, there are obviously cultural differences, there are national differences, but people don't really differ that much. Most people in the world and most young people in the world want the same things. They want respect, they want interesting work, and they want to earn enough to live on. I don't think that changes. How it's changed, it's made me realize that there are many different places in the world. You can't assume your way of doing things is better. You've got something to learn from absolutely everybody. And one of the things I did in my last few years on the staff of the Financial Times, I wrote an article about business travel. And the reason I loved business travel, I like traveling on business more than I like being a tourist.
Okay, tell me more about that. Why is that?
Because if you're a tourist, you basically go to the beach, you go to a museum, you go to a restaurant. You know, maybe you talk to somebody. If you go somewhere on business, you go into people's lives. You go into their offices, you go into their factories, you talk to them about what really matters to them. You really get a chance to see the country and learn about the country in a way that you don't do if you're a tourist. So other than living in the country, which I've done and you've done, it's the best way to get to know a place.
Michael, how do you collect all this knowledge when you're traveling? Do you have a habit? Do you have a journal? How do you do that?
I just try and remember it. Sometimes I send members of my family an email and I say, I want to tell you all of this, but also I want to remember all these things. You know, you've got to remember I was and am a writing journalist. So as soon as I got something, I try and include it in what I write. I also, and I hope this lasts as I get older, I got a good memory. So I remember things and I can put them into my writing. As you see in the book, I've remembered things that happened, long before the internet, for example.
That was one of my questions because it's so full of details on even how you met the person, what happened during the meeting. And I was like, how does he collect all this knowledge? So it's all in your brain.
It's in my brain, but also, now we've got everything we wrote online. But I think not that long ago, before 2004, you can have a specialist database, but otherwise there's no record of what I wrote. At home, I've got, I think, 7 very big volumes of all of my clippings, all of my articles, every one, cut out with a date and stuck in this book.
How many articles have you been writing?
I don't know, thousands.
Thousands.
Sometimes when I did this, I had to actually take down one of these big volumes and I think it was, I don't know, in 1991. And find us, there was the article.
I would love to search that archive was. Anyway, so I was, let's go back inside the Leaders Club. Michael, how, in this multi-generational office and office life, we talk quite a lot about cross-mentorship. So on how younger people, of course, need to look up to the more senior ones and learn from them, but also is a bit reversed because of the digital disruption that we have seen. So senior people can learn new skills and new approaches from younger employees. My question to you is, what's your view on that, on cross-mentorship? And then I loved chapter 6 in your book about how to lead star performers. Can we walk through the cross mentorship model and then try to think, how do you manage younger people that are star performers? How did you see great leaders doing that?
Okay, so just to answer your first question, cross mentorship, I am very committed to this. I think just as people coming into the workforce can learn from people who've been there for a long time, so people who've been in the workforce for a long time can learn from the new people coming in. If I can just mention, I hope you don't mind, Virginia, a personal story. When we were working in
Yeah.
Headspace, you started to prepare the whole idea of FT talent, and you asked me to look at your slide deck that you were going to present to the CEO. And I learned a lot from that because I learned how you were presenting information. It was much more visual than I was used to. I think in a lot of things now, a lot of the people coming into the workforce, they are naturally multimedia. So video clips, little clips, some visual representation, I think is one of the things I'm really learning. The other thing, and this is a big, big development that you really are seeing at the Financial Times, is the new importance of data. And what we're seeing is a lot of really talented younger journalists coming in who are experts at handling data, who can pull up stories out of the data. So I've learned just, 2 examples of things I've learned from younger colleagues. I think we've all got to be humble about this. We can all learn from each other. And this idea that I don't think it's that common, but some younger people saying, "Oh, these old people, they're past it. They don't know how any of this is." I had somebody saying, I had to deal with somebody the other day. They didn't even know how to turn a Word document into a PDF. Why should I deal with people like this? We've all got something to learn from each other. And I think that's one of the most important things about the multi-generational workforce. The ability to work with people of different ages, a fantastic opportunity. So I think that was the point number one. Then you asked me about managing star performers. And what this comes back to is, it comes back to what you mentioned about being a journalist. When you become a manager and when you become a leader, you are often managing people, you are usually managing people who know more about their work than you do, whatever organization you're in. And it doesn't matter what they're doing. For example, if you are working in a manufacturing company and you go into the warehouse or you go onto the factory floor, the people doing that job know much more about it than you do. The people in dealing with the customers always know more about the customers than you do. So in that kind of organization, or if you're in a highly specialized organization, I used the example of DeepMind, one of the most highly regarded artificial intelligence companies in the world. And, I talked about how managers work there. How do you manage people who know so much? And it's the skills of a journalist. Ask them. Just ask them. Get them to explain to you what they're doing. And also, asking somebody to explain something to somebody who's not that much of an expert is a very good discipline. Because if you can't explain it in simple terms, maybe you don't understand it as well as you think you do. So I think managing people, it's about, if I had to have one word for being a journalist or being a manager or being anybody really going into the workforce, curiosity. Be curious. Ask people, what are you doing? Can you explain to me what you're doing? Not only will you learn from it, but you're showing those people respect. People like to be asked about what they're doing. They like to be shown, actually, I understand you're doing something important. So I think when it comes to managing star performers, be curious about them. Ask them what they're doing and get them to explain it and say to them, look, you know more about this than I do. So if I'm going to manage the organization, I need to have a better understanding of what you're doing.
But if there is one thing that we see in big organizations, Paul, is the silos modality of working, a bit territorial. I know what I'm doing. You're with the commercial side, so we shouldn't talk to you. That's maybe what happens in this state-to-church relationship. And most of the time you have with cultural products or cultural industries, such as one of journalism, theater, museums. It happens quite a lot. You have the commercial side, the one that needs to make money, and then the intelligentsia on the other side, so the minds. And I would love to, if you have any cases or if you would love to share your experience around that, how do we go around territorial leaders? And people that approach the job as I'm defending my team, I'm defending my department, and you are a manager, and maybe your job is really being that hybrid role in the middle, a bit the diplomat. How would you go about that, especially if you're a younger person that doesn't earn, or is earning and doesn't have yet the trust of a system? How do you set yourself up for success with such a leadership, a territorial leadership?
Really, really good question. And actually, it's a really relevant question for the Financial Times, because at the Financial Times, because we believe so strongly in editorial independence and editorial integrity, in fact, the commercial and the editorial sides keep a real distance from each other. When I became a manager, I had to talk to the commercial side. And what you've got to start to do, I think, is to understand what their needs are, where are they coming from, and explain to them where the journalists are coming from. I often had to explain to the commercial people, if we change what we write to suit your customer, to suit your company advertiser, we're not going to be much use to that advertiser in the future. It's explaining that. Now, if you're a young person in an organization, silos are real. Territorialism is real. As human beings, we are territorial. We've always done that since, prehistoric time. It's human nature. Once again, I think curiosity and interest. If you go to somebody who's very territorial, very defensive, and you say to them, instead of saying, stop being that way, say to them, can you just explain to me what's up? Maybe they'll be impatient. Maybe they won't have time. Just keep trying. It's all about understanding where people are coming from. And also understanding, for example, that people are maybe working on different things and they think they're not friends with each other, whereas actually they're working on the same thing, and you can bring them together. It takes time. You're not going to win every battle either. We don't live in utopia. We live in a real world where, as I say, people are territorial. But I think the more you can ask people, tell me what you're doing, try and think also, what is behind what they're saying? What is behind that territoriality? What are they really defending? The other thing, I found this as a manager, one of the most valuable things I ever learned, and it's a skill I think you can use anywhere in life, is repeat back to people what they said to you. So if somebody says to you, in this department, we don't really want to deal with Department X because Department X does this and this and that, and I don't like the way they do it, and I don't like their systems. If you then say, okay, so you don't like Department X because you're worried about their systems, and you don't think, they say, well, that's right. And they say, tell me a little bit more about that. I think often all people want, and this is true of a manager, it's true of a parent, all people want is to know that they've been listened to. And really listen to. And the way you can show somebody that you've listened to them is by telling them what they told you. And doing it in good faith, doing it honestly, so that you can show them, actually, I've really heard what you've said.
And I think it's such a good skill for leaders. It's being a good listener. And I think this is not just about internal leadership, but it's also externally. When you're facing new clients' needs and you're trying to interpret the market as well. So not as, I think as a manager or as an innovator, as a disruptor, you need to listen first. And I think what you talked about before, business travels, it's quite intriguing because to me it's the best way to listen to new things and just, really being the one traveling. And in a certain sense, even like invading someone else's space gives you the opportunity to be listening and only listening. And I think that's such an important and undervalued skill most of the time. So thank you so much, Michael. You have shared so much. I love this. I would love to stay even longer and longer. But one of the very, very special parts of the Talent Show podcast is that we welcome challengers to our show. So, Michael, we are going to welcome now in the studio the two challengers that we have for you today that are going to ask you the 2 questions of a day. And I'll leave the floor then to our 2 challengers to ask directly to Michael Skapinker all their question. Desi, let's start with you. Let's give a little introduction about you, what you have been doing, why you're here, FT Talent, how did you came, and then, of course, your question to Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. My name is Desislava. I'm from Bulgaria, and I was part of the 2020 Challenge Edition, which was very, very insightful and amazing experience. Currently, I live here in London and work as a data analyst. Lately, I have seen a lot of debates in the online space regarding which is the most underrated quality a business leader should possess. Some people say it's kindness, other claims it's the empathy. Can you please share your point of view with us?
Well, it's a really good question, Desi. I think kindness matters, empathy matters, decisiveness matters. You can't always be kind, unfortunately. I would say if I had to think of one word that a business leader, a characteristic that a business leader needs, I would say it's the ability to integrate. The ability to integrate a lot of information, a lot of different situations, and a lot of different people. In other words, to put their ego a bit further back and to think, what am I looking at here? And how can I bring it all together? Information comes at us now at such a fast rate, not only commercial business information, but also geopolitical information. Business leaders now have to deal with geopolitical issues that they haven't had to deal with before. They've got to take positions, they're expected to take positions. The ability to integrate, I think I would say that is the number one characteristic.
Thank you, thank you. Really appreciate the answer.
All right. Theo, hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for letting me join the FT Talent podcast.
Oh, we are so happy to have you here. So, Theo, tell us a bit more about you, where you're coming from, and of course, you ask your question to Michael.
Of course. I'm from Hong Kong and I came to London to study law. I'm a second-year law student at King's College London. Right now, previously I joined the FT Talent Bocconi Challenge, which was in collaboration with Bocconi University in Italy. It was same as Desi. It was really fun. Michael, first, thank you very much for your sharing. I'm actually a big fan of your book, Inside the Leaders Club. Well, in your this newly released book, you talk a lot about how corporations can meet society's demand. Especially, you talk about ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. I think values do play a very important role in this society right now. And my question for you is, how can a corporation meet the needs of shareholders, make profits while being socially responsible?
Thea, thank you. That is a really interesting question. And the answer is that it is sometimes really difficult. It's sometimes really difficult to make all of those things work. I talk about one company in my book, which I think has managed to do this. It's Walmart, the big US retail giant. Now, Walmart is a company that gets a lot of opposition. A lot of campaigners really love to hate Walmart. And I don't want to defend Walmart. I'm not here to represent Walmart. Walmart has been criticized, for example, for how much they pay their employees, for, the fact that they've wiped out a lot of small retailers. But I think what Walmart discovered, and this was really during Hurricane Katrina, was actually if you start to do good for people, you are more highly regarded by your customers, you become a better place to work. But I think what Walmart began to discover is that they could actually make money by being more environmentally responsible. They discovered that if they cut their energy use, that helped to cut their costs. If they cut their packaging, that meant they used less plastic, their goods were lighter, they were cheaper to transport. I think it's not always easy to do this, but I think for ESG to work, companies have got to find that golden spot where basically what works for the shareholders works for society as well. It's not always possible. And I don't want to be idealistic about it or starry-eyed about it. We see a lot of pressure, for example, on the fossil fuel companies. They can try to mitigate the damage they're doing to society. They can start to move to more sustainable energy. But frankly, sometimes you're not going to be able to do it. Sometimes what's good for shareholders is not good for society. The companies that can make that work are the companies I think are going to have the most enduring future. They're going to be more profitable and they're going to have that social license to operate in our society. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Theo. Like I say, I don't think there's a simple answer.
No, yeah, you didn't. You did answer my question really well. Thank you so much. I really love your book, especially when you talked about the values that society can impose on corporations. I think it's important to think long term when it comes to managing a corporation. So thank you so much. I really enjoy speaking with you.
Well, thank you both.
Oh, Thank you. And thank you so much, guys. But above all, thank you to you, Michael, for sharing all your wisdom with us for our lovely conversation today. Of course, check it out inside the Leaders Club, how top companies deal with pressing business issues. It's newly released. I really highly suggest to read the book. I learned so much from the book, but above all from a person like Michael that I think you notice how nice and kind he is. And I think is one of the best qualities I found in him as my one of the very first people I worked with and for here at the Financial Times. So thank you so much, Michael, for your kindness today and for sharing all of your insights.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you to Desi and Theo, and thank you to all of you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Up to the next episode. This has been The Talent Show, which is produced by the FT Talent team, Aya Al-Shihabi, and me, Virginia Stagni. Our podcast producer, editor, and sound engineer is Arturo Ochoa, and our social media producer is Letizia Clementi. Our music is by Dennis Kishuk. Check out all of the Talent Show episodes at fttalent.ft.com, subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and follow FT Talent on socials for updates. Until next time, and keep listening.